17 human warships materialized in the Vareth corridor at 0300 Galactic Standard Time. Silent, precise, absolutely still. 340 Kavari Dominion vessels advancing from the northern quadrant stopped. Their formation held for exactly 11 seconds before the lead flagship transmitted a single encrypted burst to their war council. 280 Sioux collective ships moving in from the eastern approach executed an immediate tactical pause. Not retreat, not advance, just stop. 620 alien warships, 17 human vessels, and between them 400,000 human colonists on 3 worlds that the Galactic Council had decided didn't matter enough to protect. For 72 hours, nobody fired a single shot. The long-range scanners aboard Conclave Station detected the human ships at 0314. By 0330, emergency session alerts were cascading through 412 member delegations. By 0400, the Grand Conclave Chamber was filled with beings who had governed the galaxy for 12,000 years, and every single one of them was asking the same question. How did a Grade 3 species build this? Ambassador Chauveth, eldest of the Velhari, stood at the central dais. 12,000 years old, ancient when Earth's pyramids were new. The being's massive stone-gray form moved with the deliberate slowness of continental drift, and when it spoke, the translation feeds carried a voice like gravel pouring down a metal pipe. Impossible, Bio. The word hung in the chamber. Their file, Chauveth continued, is 14 pages long. Councillor Dreth of the IRETH delegation leaned forward, feathers rustling. 14 pages. Humanity has been observed for 80 standard years. 14 pages. And yet, another voice. The Sioux Collective's primary delegate, a being of translucent membranes and calculating eyes. Their vessels register energy signatures 4.7 times our flagship's output. 4.7. The number rippled through the chamber like a shockwave. Scan again, Chauveth commanded. There must be an error. They scanned again. The 17 ships were still there, still silent, still holding the exact position where 400,000 human lives hung in the balance. And in a small observation room off the main chamber, Ambassador Marcus Webb stood at a window watching the stars and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. To understand how humanity arrived at this moment, how 17 ships could stop 620 without firing a single shot, you need to know what happened 3 years earlier. You need to know about the insult. The Grand Conclave chamber smelled like burning copper and old rain. That was the first thing Marcus noticed when he walked through the 40-foot doors. The second thing he noticed was that there was no chair for him. The chamber rose in a wide spiral level after level of curved seating, carved from stone so dark it looked like frozen night. 412 civilizations had representatives seated at the main table below. 412 species that had earned the right to sit, to speak, to vote. The light inside came from bioluminescent panels running along the walls, shifting color slowly through hues that corresponded to the emotional spectrum of the Velhari, the oldest species in the room, the ones who had built this place 12,000 years ago. Marcus Webb stood at the railing of what the council called the observer gallery, and he kept his face absolutely calm. Because that is what you do when you are the first representative of your entire species, and every set of eyes in the room, human and otherwise, is watching to see how you react to being put in a pen. The observer gallery, a polite name for what it actually was, a holding area, a place where species that did not matter stood and watched the species that did. There were 9 beings in the gallery that day, 4 humans, including Marcus and his deputy Avalon Reeves, who had graduated top of her class at the Interplanetary Diplomatic Institute and was now standing very still, breathing very carefully. Beside them stood 2 representatives from the Murath, small, 6-limbed beings with silver fur, who had been in this gallery for 60 years. 60 years of standing, of watching, of waiting for an invitation that never came. And 3 tall, thin beings from a species Marcus didn't recognize, who hadn't introduced themselves and didn't look like they intended to. Below, the session had already started. Marcus had been briefed on council protocol before arrival. Sessions began at a specific harmonic tone which none of the human delegates could actually hear, but which apparently signaled the start of formal proceedings. The first hour was typically administrative. Routine motions, scheduling confirmations, acknowledgments of new observers. That last part was supposed to include them. It did not. An hour passed, then another. The council moved through 17 separate agenda items without once acknowledging that humanity had entered the room. Marcus watched. He memorized faces, learned body language of species he had only read about, watched who deferred to whom, who interrupted who sat close together and who sat at opposite ends of the table. He was building a map in his head, not of stars, of relationships, of leverage, of the quiet architecture of power that no briefing document had fully captured. Beside him, Avalon wrote in her notebook. Her hand was steady, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders. She'd been preparing for this moment her entire career. They all had. The acknowledgement came in the third hour, casually buried between a motion about shipping lane taxes and a report on a territorial border dispute in a system 300 light years away. The session called her a thin avian species whose feathers were deep green, read from its panel in a flat tone. Observer registration for cycle 1847. New observer group. Species designation human. Home system Sol. Provisional status. Observation rights only. No voice. No vote. No standing. Gallery position 4. 14 words. That was humanity's introduction to the Galactic Council. 14 words and a gallery position number. Avalon wrote something in her notebook. Said nothing. Marcus said nothing. And then Chauveth spoke. The Velhari elder turned those two independent eyes up toward the observer gallery, and his voice came through the translation feed like ancient stone grinding against itself. I see the mayfly species has arrived, dressed in borrowed starlight as expected. Laughter moved through the chamber, not loud, not cruel in the way humans might be cruel, but present, a ripple of amusement from 412 civilizations who found the comparison accurate and worth acknowledging. The mayfly species, a creature that lived for a single day, something that came and went too fast to matter. Marcus had read the translation notes on Velhari speech patterns before arrival. When Chauveth said borrowed starlight, it meant technology obtained rather than developed, the implication being that humanity had not truly earned its place among the stars, that we had found a shortcut, that we were tourists in a galaxy we did not understand. The laughter faded. The session moved on. Nobody looked at the gallery again. Marcus turned to Avalon. She had stopped writing. She was looking at him, waiting to see how he would handle it, whether he would respond, whether he would demand recognition, whether he would do anything at all. Marcus allowed himself a small smile, the same smile he'd given Avalon 3 years ago, the smile of someone who knows something you don't. Write that down, he said quietly. The date, the exact words. Who laughed? Write it all down. She did. They stood there for another 2 hours watching a council that did not know them, mocking something it had not bothered to understand, governing a galaxy it assumed would remain exactly as it was. When the session ended and the light shifted back to neutral white, Marcus was the last one to leave the gallery. He stood at the railing for an extra moment, looking at the empty chamber below, at the 412 chairs arranged in a perfect arc, at the space at the outer edge of the table where no chair had been placed for them. He was not angry. Anger would have been wasteful. He was paying attention. And in his experience, that was a much more dangerous thing. The human quarters aboard Conclave Station were narrow and functional, the kind of space designed by people who hadn't expected their guests to need much. One porthole looked out into the dark. Through it, Marcus could see the slow rotation of the station's outer ring, and beyond it, nothing but stars. Dr. Robert Hayes was already seated when Marcus and Avalon arrived. Robert was their xenohistorian, a compact, quiet man in his mid-50s with a habit of folding his hands when he was thinking hard and unfolding them when he'd reached a conclusion. He'd been studying the Galactic Council for 23 years without ever expecting to be aboard one of its stations. He looked like a man who had been handed something he'd spent his whole life dreaming about and was now slightly suspicious of it. You saw the session transcript, Marcus asked. I have. Robert unfolded his hands. Conclusion reached. Chauveth is 12,000 years old and has been wrong before. Though he paused rarely in public. Avalon set her notebook on the table. They didn't even look at us for 3 hours. They looked, Robert said. They just didn't consider what they were looking at. Marcus poured water for himself and stood at the porthole. The station's rotation was slow enough that the stars outside appeared to drift, moving gently from one edge of the window to the other in long, lazy arcs. "Tell me what the archives say about us," Marcus said. Robert unfolded his hands again. Humanity's file in the Council database is 14 pages long. Marcus turned from the porthole. 14. 14, Robert repeated. The Velhari file is approximately 900,000 pages. The Sioux Collective's file is 240,000 pages. The smallest file belonging to a full council member is the Wrath, a species of semi-aquatic beings who've been spacefaring for only 800 years, and their file is still 4,000 pages long. The room was quiet for a moment. "What do the assessments say?" Marcus asked. Robert opened his tablet and read without editorializing. Assessment 1, roughly 80 years ago. Species demonstrates early-stage technological development, likely candidate for natural plateau within 2 to 3 generations. He scrolled. Assessment 2, 60 years ago. Species has achieved early faster-than-light travel. Assessment revised. Plateau expected within 1 generation as resource and social pressures stabilize development. Another scroll. Assessment 3, 40 years ago. Plateau has not occurred. Development continues at anomalous rate. Flagged for continued observation. One more. Assessment 4, 20 years ago. No plateau detected. Development curve remains outside standard parameters. Origin of acceleration unclear. Possible external assistance suspected. Avalon's pen stopped moving. External assistance. They think someone gave us the technology. Robert confirmed, because the alternative that a species only 200 years in a spaceflight could develop this consistently without help did not fit their models. Marcus sat down by the porthole. Outside, a star he didn't know the name of drifted slowly to the left and disappeared behind the edge of the frame. He thought about the history he'd grown up with. Not the clean version told at ceremonies, but the real one. The one full of catastrophe and recovery, of things going wrong in ways that should have ended everything and somehow not ending everything. The plagues that swept through populations and left behind people who learned to build medicine. The famines that starved civilizations into dust and left behind people who learned to reshape the earth to grow food. The conflicts that tore apart everything humanity had built and left behind people who learned eventually, slowly, painfully to build better things the next time. Every disaster had produced an adaptation. Every adaptation had made them stranger, more capable, harder to predict. Humans didn't learn from success. They learned from catastrophe. And they'd experienced enough catastrophe that by the time they looked up at the sky and decided to go there, they were carrying inside them 10,000 years of hard-won lessons about surviving things that should have finished them. The Council had never seen a species like that because no species quite like that had ever walked through their door before. They think it was luck, Robert had said, setting down his tablet, or that we had help. Those are the two working theories in the xenohistorical community out here. Nobody has seriously proposed the third option, which is, Avalon asked, that this is simply what we are. The formal memo arrived while they were reviewing the session transcript. Avalon slid the document across the table without comment. Marcus picked it up. It was from the Council's Classification Division, stamped with the session date and delivered to all observer status groups. A routine document apparently sent to all new observers upon arrival, placing them formally within the Council's species classification system. Humanity had been designated Grade 3, Emerging Species. Grade 3 was the category for civilizations that had not yet left their home star system. Humanity had 17 colony worlds, had been operating outside the home system for 60 years, had established permanent settlements on planets the Council didn't even know existed yet. Grade 3. Marcus set the document down carefully. He did not bend it or crumple it. He was very deliberate about that. "We're going to file an objection," he said. "Of course," Avalon said, already writing. "Formal. Documented. Submitted through the correct channels with every piece of supporting evidence we can attach to it." "And when they ignore it?" Robert asked. "Not cruelly, just practically. Then we'll have a record that they ignored it." Marcus looked at the document sitting flat on the table between them. "Everything they dismiss, every correction they refuse, every door they close, it gets documented, all of it." Robert looked at him for a long moment, then he nodded once. The slow, deliberate nod of a man who had spent his career studying civilizations and had just understood something he hadn't fully understood before. "You're not trying to change their minds right now," Robert said. "No, you're building something." Marcus pulled the document toward him and read it one more time. Grade 3, Emerging Species. 14 pages in a database where the oldest members had files measured in the hundreds of thousands. "I'm doing what humans do with blank spaces," Marcus said. "I'm filling them in." The objection was filed the next morning. It was thorough, professionally written, accompanied by 60 pages of documentation, mission logs, colony census data, trade records, and a brief xenohistorical summary that Robert wrote in one night without sleeping. It was formally received by the Council's administrative office, assigned a case number, placed in a queue, and there it sat. 3 weeks later, they received a one-line response. The classification had been reviewed and confirmed. Grade 3 Emerging Species. No further correspondence on the matter would be entertained at this time. Marcus filed the response in the same folder as the original document, and he went back to learning everything he could about the people who had sent it. Because here is what the Council did not know about humanity. The thing that Chauveth had missed entirely when it looked up at the observer gallery and saw a mayfly dressed in borrowed light. Humans do not give up. Not because they are reckless. Not because they are incapable of recognizing when the odds are against them. Humans are very good at recognizing when the odds are against them. They have had a great deal of practice. Humans do not give up because at some point across thousands of years of doing exactly this, getting knocked down and getting back up and finding a new angle, they stopped treating setbacks as signals to stop. They started treating them as information. Information about where the weak points were. Information about what the other side believed they could get away with. Information about the exact shape of the obstacle so that when they finally came back at it, they would know precisely where to push. Marcus was not angry at the Council. He was learning its shape, and he had filed everything they had done wrong in a folder that was going to get very heavy before any of this was finished. In his personal quarters late that night, Marcus opened his leather-bound notebook, the one he'd brought from Earth, the one he'd carried through a dozen campaigns before this one. On the first page, he wrote the date. Then he wrote the quote. "The mayfly species has arrived, dressed in borrowed starlight as expected." Below it, he wrote one more line. They didn't realize who they insulted. He closed the notebook and looked out the porthole at the stars. His brother David had died out there. 23 years ago, ship malfunctioned during the early colony runs. They'd recovered the black box. David's last transmission had been 3 words. "Keep going, Marcus." Marcus touched his fingers to the cold glass. "I am brother," he said quietly. "I am." "I am brother," he said quietly. "I am." 3 years is a long time when you are paying close attention. Marcus Webb spent them well. The first year was about relationships, about sitting in that gallery day after day, session after session, watching the Council govern a galaxy that barely acknowledged humanity existed, about learning which species had been standing in that pen for decades, about understanding who remembered their own dismissals and who might be willing to do something about it. Vix of the Murath approached Marcus during the 4th month. The small being with silver fur and 6 limbs moved with a careful grace, and when Vix spoke, the translation carried the weight of 6 decades spent standing. "First year is the hardest," Vix said. "You still expect them to notice." "And after the first year," Marcus asked, "you stop expecting. You start documenting." Vix handed Marcus a data chip. On it, a list. 40 species, all observer status, all with connections that extended far beyond what the Council saw. Trade relationships that had developed in the shadows. Information networks that had been built slowly, carefully over the generations of being ignored. "We remember everything they do to us," Vix said. "When the time comes, you'll need allies who remember." By the end of year 1, Marcus had working relationships with 6 observer species. By the end of year 2, that number was 23. By the end of year 3, 63 species were meeting quietly in human quarters in spaces designed for 4 people, but somehow accommodating delegations from across the galaxy. They shared food from 8 different worlds. Languages mixed and overlapped until Avalon Reeves, who had arrived knowing 6 alien tongues, had mastered 14, and was working on her 15th. She became more than a translator. She became a bridge. The person who could sit with a Davin historian and a Murath trader and a human lawyer and make them understand each other, not just in words but in purpose. The second year was about information. Robert Hayes worked 18-hour days cross-referencing 40 years of Earth observation data with current council operations. What emerged was a map, not of stars but of patterns, fleet movements, trade routes, infrastructure vulnerabilities, political alliances that shifted like sand but left traces in the records. "They've been watching us for 80 years, Robert said one night, exhausted, triumphant. "But we've been watching them for 40, and we've been paying attention." The data showed something the council had never bothered to verify. Humanity hadn't just expanded to 17 colony worlds. They'd mapped every council member's territory, charted every major installation, documented every shipping lane and defense network and political pressure point across 800 light years. Not as an act of aggression, as a habit. Because when you come from a species that spent 10,000 years filling in blank spaces on maps, you don't stop just because the maps now include stars. James Keller, the legal specialist who had joined the delegation in year 2, spent his time doing something different, something that would matter more than anyone realized. He read the council's own laws, all of them, 12,000 years of precedent, governance protocols, membership requirements, classification standards, the entire legal framework that held the Galactic Council together. And he documented every single place where the council violated its own rules. 847 instances. 847 times the council had bent its own laws to maintain the existing power structure, to delay membership for species that qualified, to ignore appeals that should have been heard, to classify civilizations based on political convenience rather than actual capability. "It's not corruption," James said, presenting his findings. "It's worse, it's institutional. They don't even realize they're doing it anymore. They've been doing it so long that it's become normal." "Can we use it?" Marcus asked. "Every word of it, when the time comes." The third year was about building. What started as informal coordination became something more structured. The 63 observer species weren't just sharing information anymore. They were trading with each other, directly, outside council oversight. The Marath had manufacturing capabilities the council had never bothered to assess. The Davin controlled resources on worlds the council had classified as uninhabitable, but which were perfectly suitable for their physiology. Humanity brought agricultural techniques and medical technology that dozens of species needed but couldn't access through official channels because they lacked council standing. An economy emerged, small at first, then not so small. By the third year, observer species were conducting more trade with each other than with most council members. They were building something that existed parallel to the official structure, something the council couldn't see because it wasn't looking. And all the while, Marcus documented everything. Every slight, every procedural violation, every door closed in faces that had been waiting patiently for generations. The file grew heavy. Then the Kavari and the Sioux started fighting. The alert came through during a working lunch. Avalon's tablet lit up red, the color reserved for sector-wide emergencies. "Territorial conflict," she read aloud. "Aethan cluster, Kavari Dominion versus Sioux Collective. Fleets mobilizing." Marcus set down his fork carefully. "How far from our colonies?" 300 light years. "But the Aethan cluster is resource-rich. Trace minerals. Strategic position." "If this escalates—" "It will escalate," Robert interrupted. He was already pulling up historical data. "The Kavari and Sioux have been positioning for this for 2 years. This isn't a border skirmish. This is 2 philosophies colliding over the same territory." The Kavari Dominion believed in legitimate expansion, in taking what they could hold and holding what they took. They'd built their entire civilization on calculated aggression. The Sioux Collective believed in patience, in infiltration, in strategic withdrawal, and long-term positioning. They'd spent 2,000 years expanding through methods so subtle most species didn't realize it was happening until the Sioux were already there. When those two approaches met over a cluster of mineral-rich worlds, the result was predictable. What wasn't predictable was how fast it spread. Within 6 weeks, the conflict had expanded well beyond the Aethan cluster. Both sides were maneuvering fleets, establishing blockades, testing each other's boundaries in a series of probing engagements that each side denied were actual hostilities. The council convened emergency sessions. Committees were formed. Subcommittees were formed to advise the committees. Representatives gave speeches. Speeches were formally entered into the record. The Kavari and the Sioux kept moving their fleets. On a Tuesday that Marcus would not forget, Avalon came into his office holding a document with the particular careful way she held things when she was angry, but being professional about it. They've designated the Varath Corridor as a conflict buffer zone. The Varath Corridor was a navigational lane that ran through a section of space the Council had, for bureaucratic reasons, never formally assigned to any single species. It was technically unclaimed territory. It was also the primary transit route between humanity's 3 outermost colony worlds and the rest of human space. Cutting that corridor would effectively strand 400,000 human colonists. Marcus took the document. Read it once, twice, a third time. The language was courteous in the way that only very old institutions know how to be, which is to say, it was dressed in the language of concern while delivering something that was not concerned with humanity at all. The Council expressed its deep appreciation for humanity's understanding. It noted that the colony worlds in question were of course observer status settlements and therefore did not carry the same protections as full member settlements. It assured them that relocation assistance would be considered on a case-by-case basis. Observer status settlements. Those 3 words. When is the formal session on this? Marcus asked. 4 days. I'll be there. That night, Marcus received a message from New Houston Colony, personal encryption, family channel. His niece Emma, 7 years old, the only family he had left after David died. The video showed a child's bedroom, drawings on the walls, a window looking out at an alien sky that had been her sky since she was born. Uncle Marcus, Emma said, her voice small and uncertain. They're saying we might have to leave, but this is my home. I was born here. Mom says you're at the big council place. Can you tell them this is my home? Where would we even go? Marcus watched the video. Then he watched it again and again. His hands, which had remained steady through 3 years of careful documentation and patient alliance building, shook slightly. 400,000 people, 400,000 homes, families, lives built across 3 worlds that the Council had decided were inconvenient. Observer status settlements, as if the people living there were somehow less real because their species hadn't been granted the right paperwork. Marcus made one Yamal, encrypted, routed through channels that wouldn't appear in any official log. Admiral Sterling Kincaid answered on the second pulse. Marcus, I saw the designation. The Varath Corridor, bar. I need an assessment, Marcus said. Available assets, Sector 7, defensive posture only. There was a pause, not hesitation. Consideration. How far are you willing to go? Kincaid asked. As far as necessary, Marcus said, but I prefer not to fire a single shot. Interesting. Another pause. I think we can arrange that. Give me 72 hours. I have 4 days until I address the Council. You'll have your options in 72. The call lasted 6 minutes. Marcus gave no orders, described the situation, asked for possibilities, and set in motion something the Council would not see coming. 4 days later, Marcus stood on the main floor of the Grand Conclave Chamber for the first time. Not in the gallery, not behind the railing, on the floor, where 412 civilizations conducted the business of governing a galaxy. He had submitted a formal request to address the Council under the provisions of Protocol 7, the provision that technically allowed observer status species to speak on matters directly affecting their populations. The provision had not been invoked in 200 years. The administrative team had apparently needed 3 days to locate the relevant paperwork. The chamber was full, every seat occupied. The bioluminescent panels on the walls cycled through a slow gold to violet shift that Robert had told him indicated heightened attention. Whether that was compliment or warning, Marcus wasn't certain. Possibly both. Chauveth sat at the center of the main table as always. Those 2 independent eyes found Marcus immediately. Marcus had prepared a speech, 3 versions actually, ordered from most diplomatic to least. He had intended to use the most diplomatic version. Then Chauveth spoke before Marcus could begin. The Mayfly returns. The translation feed carried amusement. With 90 days remaining to comply, I am curious what there is to discuss. The laughter was smaller this time, scattered. A few delegations, not all of them. Marcus put his prepared speech on the table in front of him. Face down, did not look at it again. Ambassador Chauveth, he said, his voice level and clear-pitched to carry through the chamber without amplification. The Galactic Council has formally requested that humanity abandon 3 settled colony worlds, including the homes of 400,000 people, in order to serve as a buffer zone for a conflict between 2 council members. He let that sit for 3 seconds. Exactly 3. I am here to inform the Council respectfully and formally that we will not be doing that. The chamber went very quiet. Marcus continued. The Council is advised to account for the current disposition of human assets in the region before proceeding further. Chauveth's 2 eyes moved slightly, an expression Marcus had learned to read as mild curiosity layered over deeper calculation. What assets does a Grade 3 species possess that would be relevant to this discussion? Marcus allowed himself a small smile, the kind of smile that comes from holding cards your opponent doesn't know exist. I suggest, Ambassador, that the Council check its long-range scanners before the end of this session. He gathered his papers and returned to the gallery. He could feel the weight of 412 civilizations watching him go. 72 hours earlier, 17 vessels had departed from 3 different human shipyards. They had moved through space at velocities that Council vessels would have considered reckless. They had arrived at the Varath corridor precisely on time, and they had taken up positions that were mathematically perfect for defending exactly 3 colony worlds. At the moment Marcus finished speaking, Conclave Station's long-range scanning systems were detecting something in the Varath corridor that had not been there 4 days before. 17 ships, human vessels. None of them registered with the Council because observer species were not required to register their vessels. None of them classified in the Council's database because the Council had never bothered to ask what humanity was building. They were sleek and dark, arranged in a formation that military analysts would later describe as textbook defensive positioning. And they were broadcasting on open frequencies in every major galactic language, in a calm, clear, non-threatening voice that the corridor was occupied and that civilian transports were advised to plan alternate routes while the situation was being assessed. The Kavari fleet, which had been advancing toward the corridor from the northern quadrant, 340 vessels strong, stopped. The Sioux fleet, which had been moving toward it from the east, 280 ships in total, stopped. Neither of them had encountered human military hardware before. Neither of them knew what it could do. And in the calculus of conflict, an unknown factor of 17 vessels positioned perfectly and holding absolutely still was a very heavy variable. The first analysis came through to the Council chamber within minutes. Energy signatures, power output, defensive capabilities. The numbers made no sense. 4.7 times our flagship's output, someone read aloud. That can't be right. They scanned again. 4.7. Adaptive hull composition. Analysis inconclusive. Appears to restructure at molecular level in response to stress. Kinetic barriers reading at 97% efficiency. Weapons systems. Classification unknown. Counselor Dreth of the Irath delegation stood abruptly. This is a violation military deployment in a designated buffer zone without Council authorization. The corridor is unclaimed space, came a voice from the Sioux delegation. If it belongs to no one, it belongs to them as much as to anyone. Observer species are not permitted to operate unregistered military assets. They're not registered, another voice pointed out, because we've never required them to be. Observer protocols don't mandate military registry. The argument cascaded. 412 voices all discovering simultaneously that the rules they'd written had a gap they'd never noticed because they'd never imagined they'd need to. Marcus was back in his office when Avalon's communication panel lit up with an incoming transmission from the Council chamber. They want to talk, she said. Tell them I'm available tomorrow morning, Marcus said, at 900 hours. She looked at him. Not tonight. Tomorrow morning. Let them look at those ships on their scanners tonight. Let them think about what they don't know about us. She entered the response. Outside the porthole, the stars drifted their slow, familiar drift. And somewhere out in the dark, 17 ships held perfectly still between what was humanity's and everyone else's making. No threats requiring no justification. Simply being there with the quiet, absolute certainty of a species that had learned long ago that the most powerful statement you can make is not a raised voice. It's an unmistakable presence. The meeting the next morning was not in the main chamber. It was in a smaller room, one Marcus had never been invited into before. A private council briefing space on level 7 of the station's administrative wing. The walls were the same carved dark stone as the main chamber, but the ceiling was lower. The lighting was steady, white, factual, not the shifting bioluminescent wash of the big hall. There was a round table with enough seats for 12. Marcus brought Avalon and Robert. The council sent 5 representatives, including at the center Chauveth. The Velhari elder looked different in a small room, still ancient, still composed, but the scale of the chamber was no longer amplifying the being's presence. Here, across 6 feet of table, Chauveth was simply an old being in a chair, and Marcus was simply a person in another chair. And they were going to talk. "You have caused considerable disruption," Chauveth said as an opening. "The conflict between the Kavhari and the Sioux caused disruption," Marcus replied. "We responded to it." Dreth leaned forward. "By placing warships in an active buffer zone without council authorization. By placing our own vessels in an unclaimed navigational corridor within range of our own settlements in response to a request that those settlements be abandoned. The corridor was selected precisely because it was unclaimed. If it belongs to no one," Marcus said calmly, "then it belongs as much to us as to anyone." One of the other representatives, a being from the Irath delegation whose name Marcus had memorized as Counselor Thesh, spoke carefully. "The vessels you deployed carry weapon systems that are not on record with the Council Defense Registry." "We have not been asked to register weapons systems with the Council Defense Registry," Marcus said. "Observer status species are not required to do so. They are also not permitted to operate unregistered military assets in disputed space. The corridor is not disputed space. The corridor is unclaimed space. And we are not operating military assets. We are operating vessels with defensive capabilities in proximity to our own populated worlds while a conflict between 2 council members moves toward those worlds." Thesh sat back. Robert beside Marcus had his hands folded on the table. His face showed calm academic interest, but Marcus knew that expression. It meant Robert was very carefully not smiling. Chauveth spoke again. The elder's voice through the translation feed was slower than usual, each word placed with deliberate care. "What are you exactly, Sirom?" The room went quiet. It was not a procedural question, not a tactical probe, not a diplomatic formality. It was a genuine question asked by a being that had watched civilizations rise and fade for 12,000 years and had just encountered something that did not fit any of its categories. Marcus let the silence sit for a moment, not to be dramatic, because the question deserved a genuine answer, not a prepared one. And genuine answers sometimes need a breath of space before they arrive. "I will try to explain it," Marcus said. He started with Earth. Earth is not a gentle planet. It never was. In the long history of life on its surface, the dominant pattern was competition. Constant, layered, relentless competition for food and territory and survival. The species that lived there did not exist in comfortable equilibrium. They pushed against each other and against the environment without pause. Robert added, quietly speaking for the first time. "The Council's xenobiologists have a category called apex predator species. Species that evolved at the top of their food chain unchallenged, which then developed intelligence. The pattern is consistent. They tend toward confidence, toward expansion, but they reach equilibrium quickly because they never needed to develop the kind of sustained problem-solving that comes from prolonged challenge. Humans," Marcus said, "evolved under pressure, continuous pressure. We were not unchallenged. We were prey as well as predator. We were cold and sick and starving and threatened from every direction. And we survived anyway. And every time we survived on something, we added it to a body of knowledge that the next generation inherited. Every species learns from experience," Dreth said. "Every species learns," Marcus agreed. "But not every species is built the way we are built. We are not optimized for comfort. We are optimized for recovery. There is a difference." He leaned forward slightly. When the Council looks at human history, you see chaos. I understand that. 200 years of spaceflight after 10,000 years of recorded civilization, much of it marked by catastrophe and conflict. To a species that has been spacefaring for 12,000 years and has achieved stability that looks unstable, unreliable, dangerous possibly. It does, Chauvette said. What you are not seeing, Marcus said, is what we built every single time we came back from one of those catastrophes. What you are not measuring is the speed of the recovery. What your models do not account for is that every failure in human history produced a lesson, and we kept those lessons. We carry them individually, culturally, institutionally. We do not discard them. We are made of them. He paused. You called us mayflies, a creature that lives one day and is gone. I understand why that comparison seemed accurate. We are young, by your standards extraordinarily young. But mayflies do not remember anything. They do not build on what came before. They simply exist for their single day and are finished. Marcus met Chauvet's eyes, both of them. Humanity is not finished. Chauvet was very still. We have been mapping this region of the galaxy for 40 years, Marcus continued, not because we were directed to, not as part of any official program, because we had people who were curious and the tools to satisfy that curiosity and in a deep and unshakable instinct to fill in blank spaces on maps. We mapped every council member's home system, transit routes and resource distributions, and population centers in the locations of council infrastructure. We did this as a matter of habit, not strategy. He let that land. That is not a threat. It is a description of what we are. We are explorers. We are builders. We are a species that looks at empty space and sees potential rather than emptiness. And we are a species that has been told since we arrived here that we do not belong at the table. You do not have the standing, Dreth said, but the certainty in the statement had thinned. By your current rules, no, but rules are things that people made, and people can change what people made when they have sufficient reason. Chauvet's eyes moved, both of them, simultaneously. Robert noticed, made a small notation in his tablet. The meeting ran for 4 more hours. No decisions were made, no commitments were given. But something shifted in that room, slowly, without announcement, the way tides shift, not with drama, but with the quiet persistence of water finding its level. When they filed out into the corridor afterward, Robert walked beside Marcus in silence for a moment. Then he said, Chauvet's eyes moved together both at once in Vohari expression that indicates something between reassessment and alarm. I have never seen a recorded instance of a Vohari council member doing that in a session. Good, Marcus said. That is not necessarily a comfortable reaction to provoke. No, Marcus said, but it is an honest one. And right now, I would rather have their honest reaction than their comfortable dismissal. They walked back toward the human quarters in the long, steady light of the station's corridors. Behind them, 17 ships in the Verath corridor continued their patient vigil. The Kavari and the Sioux had not moved in 30 hours, and the galaxy had become, in some quiet, fundamental way, a slightly different place than it had been the day before. 6 weeks. That's how long it took for the political situation to crystallize, for the standoff in the Verath corridor to transform from military tension into something larger. Something that would reshape the galaxy in ways nobody had anticipated. The Kavari and the Sioux eventually agreed to a council-mediated ceasefire. The Verath corridor was formally withdrawn from the buffer zone designation. Humanity's 3 colony worlds were never touched. The 17 ships returned to their regular patrol routes without any public announcement of their departure, which Marcus felt was the appropriate way to end that particular statement. But the session in the small room on level 7 had started something that a ceasefire between 2 other species could not stop. Word travels fast in a place where 412 civilizations share a single station. Within 3 days of the meeting with Chauvet, Marcus had received 11 private communications from representatives of other council species. Not from the senior members, not from the old powers, but from the others, the mid-tier delegations, the ones who had been full members for less than 2,000 years and still remembered what it felt like to be newer than everyone around them. And then, much more quietly, the communications began arriving from the observer gallery. Vix came first. The Marath representative arrived at Marcus's door one evening, carrying a flat data tablet and an expression of careful neutrality. You said things in that room that have been said privately for a long time, Vix told him. The difference is that when you said them, the other side listened. They listened because of the ships, Marcus said. They listened because of the ships, Vix agreed. But they heard because of the words. The Murath set the tablet on Marcus's table. It contained a list, 63 names, all of them an observer status species, all of them sitting in gallery positions, watching a table they were never invited to join. These species would like to know if you have a plan. Marcus looked at the list for a long moment. 63 civilizations. Some had been standing in that gallery for 6 decades, some for 40 years, some for only 5, and all of 40 years, some for only 5, and all of them dismissed, and all of them watching, all of them waiting for someone to try. I have an outline, Marcus said. Give me 2 weeks. Over those 2 weeks in the narrow corridor between his role as a diplomat and his role as something he did not yet have a name for, Marcus built the structure of what would later be called the Reform Coalition. It was not a rebellion. That characterization would come later from voices that wanted to delegitimize what was happening. It was a legal, procedural, formally documented proposal to amend the council's membership and governance charter. Everything was done through correct channels. Every draft was shared openly. Every argument was built on council precedent. James Keller worked 20-hour days cross-referencing 12,000 years of council jurisprudence. He could find the exact sentence in ancient precedent that made their position defensible. And then he could write the argument for it in language so clean and unambiguous that fighting it meant arguing against the council's own rules. Robert contributed the historical analysis, the patterns of classification, the statistical proof that the council's current system had become disconnected from its stated principles. Vix and the Murath contributed connections to 40 of the 63 gallery species. A Davan historian named Thane, who had 40 years of accumulated institutional memory, and the patience of someone who had long since stopped expecting justice but had not stopped working toward it, contributed a comprehensive record of every procedural violation and classification inconsistency that the council had committed over the past 2 centuries. Avalon coordinated, translated, made sure that beings from 63 different cultures, speaking 40 different languages, could understand each other, not just in words, but in intention. It was by the time they submitted it a document of remarkable thoroughness. 312 pages of formal argument, historical evidence, statistical analysis, and legal precedent, concluding with a single clear request. Full voting membership for all spacefaring species, regardless of years of spaceflight. A revised classification system based on actual capability rather than arbitrary thresholds, and the dissolution of the observer gallery as a governance structure. The council received it on a Thursday. By Friday evening, Chauvet had convened an emergency session of the senior membership to discuss it. By Saturday morning, the political battle had begun in earnest. Marcus had not expected it to be clean or easy. It was neither. The council's old guard pushed back with every tool available to them. Procedural delays, classification challenges, requests for additional study periods, referrals to subcommittees that had no authority to act. Chauvet was particularly formidable. 12,000 years of institutional experience does not make someone wrong, but it makes them very good at defending a position. And the Velhari elder defended the existing order with the calm precision of someone who genuinely believed it was correct. This system has preserved peace for millennia, Chauvet argued in one session. Rapid change has destroyed civilizations. You are proposing to restructure the fundamental governance of the galaxy based on 3 years of observation and the actions of one species. This is not wisdom. This is impatience. There were days when Marcus thought they might not get there. When the delays piled up and the subcommittee reports came back negative and the senior members closed ranks in ways that felt impenetrable. On one of those days, James came to find Marcus in his office late in the evening. He sat down across from Marcus and did not say anything for a moment. Do you know what the average length of a major council reform effort is? He asked eventually. Tell me. 340 years, from first proposal to ratification. Marcus set down the report he had been reading. We don't have 340 years. No, James said, but we have something the previous reformers didn't have. What's that? James smiled, just slightly. The ships in the corridor are still on the scanners, not our ships now. Every species that joined the coalition has contributed observers. 11 vessels total. Nobody threatened anyone. Nobody said anything. They just showed up. Marcus had not known that. He had not asked for it. The Marath sent one, James had continued. The Davin sent two. 8 other species sent one each. None of them coordinated with us directly. They just arrived in the Vareth corridor over the past week and took up positions. Marcus sat with that for a moment. They're not there for the corridor anymore, he said quietly. No, James said. The corridor dispute is resolved. They're there because this is how you signal solidarity without saying anything that can be entered into a formal record. It's the language of presence. He paused. Apparently it's a very old language in this part of the galaxy. The Velhari invented it. Marcus found that last part genuinely funny in a quiet way. The irony of using the Velhari's own methods, their own traditions, turned into something they had never intended. So we learned their tactic, Marcus said, and used it better than they did. Exactly. But the resistance continued. Week 3 brought the first major delay ruling, a subcommittee determination that the proposal required a 6-month additional study period before it could be brought to a formal vote. Week 5 brought a comprehensive report from the Classification Standards Committee recommending against all proposed reforms. Week 7 brought something different. Councillor Dreth, who had been consistently vocal in opposition, made a mistake. A small one. But enough. James had been monitoring all communication channels that the coalition had access to, not because he expected to find anything council members were too sophisticated for obvious slips, but because thoroughness was how you built a case. He found an encrypted message, routed through 3 different relays, sent from Dreth's private terminal to a contact in the Havari military command structure. The content was subtle, nothing explicitly illegal, but the intent was clear. Dreth was encouraging the Kavhari to resume military pressure in the border regions, to create instability, to make the council's position look weak, to demonstrate that reform during a time of tension would be dangerous. Dreth was trying to restart the conflict. Do we expose this? Avalon asked when James showed them the evidence. Not yet, Marcus said. Document it, secure it, but don't act. We may need this later, but using it now would make us look like we're playing dirty politics. We need to win clean. There was something else that week. Dreth approached Avalon privately, in a corridor away from recording devices. Your work has been impressive, Dreth said. The Irath counselor's feathers were arranged in what Avalon had learned to recognize as calculated friendliness. 14 languages, coordinator for 63 delegations. That takes remarkable skill. Thank you, Counselor. Have you considered what comes next after this reform effort concludes? Avalon kept her face neutral. I haven't thought that far ahead. You should. Humanity will gain membership eventually, whether this year or in 300 years. The outcome is inevitable. But those who choose the winning side early, Dreth let the implication hang. I could use someone with your talents on my staff. The compensation would be substantial. The opportunities significant. Avalon understood immediately what was being offered and what was being asked for. Betray Marcus, provide inside information on the coalition's strategy in exchange for career advancement and a promise that humanity's path to membership would be smoother. She smiled politely. I appreciate the offer, Counselor, but I'm quite satisfied with my current position. Dreth's feathers shifted, less friendly now. Consider carefully. Your people have many vulnerabilities. Trade relationships that could be disrupted. Security clearances that could be questioned. It would be unfortunate if complications arose. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Avalon told Marcus immediately. He threatened you, Marcus said, not a question, a statement. Subtly, but yes. Good. She looked at him. Good. Now we know he's scared. People who are confident don't make threats. They make policy. Dreth is operating from fear, which means he thinks we can win. Marcus made a note in his file. Document the conversation. Every detail. If we need it, we'll have it. If we don't, we still have it. Either way, Dreth just made his second mistake. The vote was scheduled for a morning when the station's light panels were set to a warm amber. A council tradition Robert had explained for major sessions. a color associated with significant decisions in Velhari culture. Marcus sat in the gallery one final time, not because he had been required to, because it felt right to end in the same place he had started. The chamber was entirely full, every seat occupied. The gallery was packed with observer species more than it had ever held in recent memory, beings pressed together along the railings watching the table below. The proposal was read into the record by the session caller. All 312 pages summarized to its essential motion in 47 words that James had written with the care of someone engraving a monument. Then the vote was called. The senior members voted first. The weighted votes, the ones that carried the most influence. The Velhari bloc voted against. As expected, the Arathi split. 3 against and 2 in favor. That was not expected. A ripple of surprise moved through the chamber. The Arathi were old guard, conservative. For 2 of them to break ranks meant something had shifted at a fundamental level. The Sioux collective, calculating as always, voted in favor after what Marcus knew had been days of private deliberation. They had determined through whatever complex analysis they employed that a restructured council served their long-term interests better than the existing one. More votes came in from across the table. They came in on both sides. And for a time, Marcus genuinely could not tell which way it was going. He kept his face still. Avalon beside him was counting quietly under her breath, tracking each vote, running the math in real time. Robert's hands were folded tight on the railing. Then the coalition member votes began. The 12 full-member civilizations that had over the previous months moved from cautious observers of the reform effort to active participants in it. They voted in favor, one by one. Each vote was entered into the record, each delegation making a choice that would be remembered. That would define how their civilization was seen for generations to come. The session caller reviewed the count. Once, then again, checking the math, verifying the weighted calculations. Then the announcement. The motion has passed. 3 words. By 4 votes. The chamber was very, very quiet. The session caller continued speaking words that had never been said in the recorded history of the Galactic Council. The membership structure will be amended. The classification system will be revised. The observer gallery will be formally dissolved within the next council cycle. Its occupants will be reclassified under the new framework. Nobody cheered, not one voice raised in celebration. It did not feel like that kind of moment. It felt like something that had been a long time coming had finally arrived. And the right response was not noise. It was a very deep breath. They filed out of the gallery in silence. In the corridor outside the chamber, Vix found Marcus and touched his arm briefly, the Marath equivalent of a handshake. 60 years, Vix said quietly. Did not finish the sentence. Did not need to. Marcus understood. 60 years standing in that gallery. 60 years waiting. And today, that wait had ended. The next morning, Marcus was called to the council chamber again. Not to the gallery, not to the small meeting room on level 7. To the main floor. A chair had been placed at the main table, in what had previously been empty space. A human chair at the council table. Marcus walked across the main floor of the Grand Conclave chamber in full session. His footsteps were very quiet against the dark stone. The sound seemed to carry forever in the vast space. He sat down. The chair was functional, unadorned, no ceremony about it, just a chair at a table, which is what a chair at a table usually is. Marcus ran his hand along the edge of the table surface. It was smooth and very slightly warm, the stone retaining some quality of all the light that had washed over it for 12,000 years. He thought about everyone on Earth who had never lived to see this, the people who had pointed telescopes at an empty sky and dared to dream that something was out there. The ones who had run the early calculations and built the early ships and gone out into the dark without knowing what they would find. The ones who had been told in one way or another by one voice or another that they were not ready, that they were too young, that they were too chaotic, that they should wait, that they should be patient, that their moment would come when the universe decided they were worthy of it. And he thought about what humanity had done instead. They had not waited to be invited. They had not waited to be told they were ready. They had shown up. They had paid attention. They had built something out of nothing. Out of 14 pages in a database and a gallery position number and a dismissal dressed up as courtesy. And here at the end of it, they were sitting at the table. Not because the galaxy had decided they deserved it, because humanity had decided they deserved it, and then had done the work to make the argument impossible to deny. Chauveth entered the chamber and took the seat at the center of the table as always. The elder settled slowly, those two ancient eyes scanning the room with the practiced sweep of a being that had seen this chamber through 12,000 years of change. When the sweep reached Marcus, it paused. For a long moment, Chauveth looked at him across the length of the table. Marcus looked back, not defiantly, not with triumph, just clearly. The way you look at someone when you have something real between you, even if that something is the memory of a long argument finally concluded. Then Chauveth did something that Marcus did not expect. The Vohari elder rose from the seat, slowly, with the great deliberate care of an ancient body performing an act of intention. And then Chauveth inclined that enormous gray head forward and down, held it for 3 seconds, and raised it again. Marcus had learned enough about Velhari culture to understand what he was seeing. In Velhari tradition, a bow from a seated position to a standing one means respect given upward to someone above you. A bow performed while rising given at the same level means something different. It means acknowledgement between equals. It means I see you now as I did not see you before. It is not an apology exactly, but it is the closest thing the Velhari have to one. Marcus inclined his head in return, not deeply, not in deference, at the same angle, for the same 3 seconds. They sat back down. The session was called to order. 413 civilizations around the table, plus 11 new additions waiting for their formal seating to be arranged over the coming weeks. The work of the council continued as it always had, slowly, with great weight, but now with different weight behind it. Weight that was distributed across more hands and more perspectives and more kinds of experience than had ever sat at that table before. As the session began around him, Marcus opened his notebook, the leather-bound one he had been keeping since that very first day in the gallery. Since Chauveth had called them mayflies and the chamber had laughed. He turned to the first page. The entry was simple: a date, a name, a quote, and a note in his own handwriting at the bottom that said, "Write this down." He wrote one more line beneath everything. They didn't realize who they insulted. He paused, then added, "Honestly, I'm glad they didn't, because the version of us that had to earn this, the version that was told no and documented it, that was dismissed and kept showing up, that placed ships in a corridor without firing a single shot and built a coalition out of 63 species who had been waiting for someone to try that, is the version that deserved to sit here. Not because we were the strongest, not because we were the oldest, because we never, not once for a single day, considered the alternative." He closed the notebook. The session continued, and for the first time Marcus was part of it. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy shifted in ways both large and small. On New Houston Colony, Emma Webb received a message from her uncle. The crisis was over. The colonies were safe. She could stay in the only home she had ever known. She recorded a response, a 7-year-old's thank you, showing him her drawings, her room, the alien sky that was her sky. "I knew you'd fix it," she said. "Mom said you always do." Avalon Reeves was promoted to Senior Diplomatic Corps, offered a position coordinating the integration of 63 new civilizations into the formal council structure. She accepted. The 17 human ships returned to Sol system. No parades, no celebrations, just quiet return to their regular duties, the way professionals do. But the 11 ships from other observer species remained in the Varoth corridor for 6 more months, holding their positions. A reminder, a statement. The language of presence spoken fluently by beings who had learned it from watching humanity reinvent it. Counselor Dreth was formally censured when the evidence of the attempted sabotage was finally released. Not by Marcus, by 3 senior council members who had reviewed the documentation and decided that certain lines once crossed required consequences. On Earth, the news broadcast showed crowds in every major city, not celebrating conquest, celebrating recognition, celebrating the end of a wait that had lasted 3 years for humanity and 60 years for some of the species that had stood beside them. Robert Hayes published a paper that would become the standard xenohistorical text on accelerationist species theory. The paper that finally gave the Council's academic community the framework to understand what humanity was and why their models had never predicted it. James Keller became senior legal counsel to the Reform Coalition, which transformed from an ad hoc alliance into a permanent caucus within the council structure, representing not just the newly admitted members, but any species that believed the system could be made more just. Vix of the Murath finally sat at the main table. After 60 years in the gallery, 60 years of standing, of watching, of waiting. When Vix took that seat for the first time, the Murath representative said nothing, just sat down, placed small hands on the table surface, and breathed. That was enough. And somewhere in the records of Conclave Station, a file that had once been 14 pages long began to grow, updated with new information, new assessments, new understanding of what humanity was and what it meant for the galaxy that humanity was now part of its governance. The file would eventually reach 4,000 pages, then 40,000, then more. But the first 14 pages remained, unchanged. A reminder of how badly you can misunderstand something when you don't bother to look closely. When you assume that young means simple, that fast means reckless, that different means wrong. The galaxy learned, slowly, with great weight, but it learned. On a night 6 months after the vote, Marcus stood at the porthole in his quarters looking out at the stars. Behind him on his desk, 3 leather-bound notebooks, 3 years of documentation, of patient accumulation, of building something where nothing had existed before. He opened the first notebook again, read the first entry. The mayfly species has arrived, dressed in borrowed starlight as expected. He thought about his brother David, 23 years gone, lost in the early days of exploration when humanity was still learning how to navigate the stars. David's last words, "Keep going, Marcus." "I did, brother," Marcus said quietly to the empty room. "We all did." Outside, the stars drifted their eternal drift, and among them somewhere 17 ships patrolled the Vareth corridor, not as a statement anymore, just as a presence, as a reminder that humanity had arrived, had taken its seat, had changed the galaxy by refusing to accept that change was impossible. Someone had told Marcus once that history is not made by people who wait for the right moment. It is made by people who decide that the moment they are in is the only moment there is and then act accordingly. Humanity had acted. 63 species sitting in a gallery with nothing but patience and a growing file of documented slights had found something to rally behind, had pulled something into existence that 12,000 years of institutional habit insisted could not happen. They had called humanity mayflies, creatures that live one day and are gone. But mayflies don't build, don't remember, don't fight back. Humans do all three, and they never stop. Marcus closed the notebook one final time and set it on the shelf beside the other 2. Tomorrow there would be another session. More work to do, more blank spaces to fill in. But tonight he allowed himself this moment, this breath, this recognition of how far they had come. From a gallery position and an insult to a chair at the table, and a bow between equals. 3 years, 63 species, 400,000 lives protected, and a galaxy forever changed. They didn't realize who they insulted, but they do now.